The next morning, I walked into the courthouse, the feeling of déjà vu creeping over me as I approached the counter. It was the same place where my father's power had once loomed over me, where the fate of my future had been decided long before I had any say in it. But today, I was the one holding the power. I filed the motion for the injunction, the one that would freeze all actions by Braden Tech's board until the court could investigate the fraudulent transfers. Sylvia had made sure we had every legal angle covered, and Miles had done the forensic work to prove the signatures were forged. There was no way Leonard would be able to wriggle out of this. The evidence was irrefutable. As I left the courthouse, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray. It was like the whole world was waiting, holding its breath. But I knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The days that followed felt like a blur of waiting. I was no longer a spectator in my own life. I had taken the reins, and I was steering it toward an ending only I could dictate. The press got wind of the legal motion, and soon, the whispers started. Leonard's carefully crafted image was beginning to crack. The media, the corporate world, even the military blogs, everyone was talking. They were watching as his empire began to unravel, piece by piece. And then came the call. It was Sylvia. "Rowan," she said. Her voice steady but with a hint of excitement. "We've got him. The judge just signed the injunction. The assets are frozen, and the board is being forced to stop any further sales. The truth is coming out." I felt the weight of her words sink in. This was real. We were winning, but there was no time to celebrate. Leonard wouldn't go down without a fight, and he had allies. This battle was far from over. The night before the next hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the small desk in my apartment. Papers scattered in front of me. The documents from the vault, the legal papers, the evidence, everything had been laid out in front of me. I had everything I needed to bring Leonard and his entire family down, but there was still one last thing. I picked up the flash drive, the one with the final video message from Grandpa Marshall. I hadn't watched it yet. I hadn't had the time. But now, as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, I knew it was time. I plugged it into my laptop. Grandpa's face appeared on the screen, the same calm, steady expression I remembered from my childhood. He was older here, thinner, but his voice still carried the same weight. "If you're seeing this, Rowan," he said, his voice even, "then the time has come for you to finish what I started. You've been through hell, but you've always known what's right. You've got the strength to finish this." I watched, my heart pounding as he continued. The company, the Legacent, was never about the money. It was always about the people, about doing right by them. "I trusted you with this, Rowan. I knew you would understand." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "The people who tried to bury you? They'll try to destroy everything you've built. But you've got something they'll never have: truth. And truth is more powerful than any lie they can throw at you." The screen went black. I sat back, my mind racing. Grandpa had known all along what would happen. He'd known that Leonard would try to destroy me, that he would stop at nothing to erase me from the company and from the family's history. But he'd also known that I would be the one to fight back. I stood up, my mind made up. Tomorrow, Leonard Greaves would face the truth. And there would be no escaping it. The next morning, I woke to a different world. The weight of what was about to unfold pressed down on me like a storm waiting to break. The sky was a dull shade of gray, the kind of overcast that felt ominous but calm at the same time. It mirrored what I felt inside, a calm before the chaos. But the chaos was coming, and this time, it wasn't someone else's war, it was mine. I dressed quickly, my movements deliberate and steady. No nerves. No doubt. I had prepared for this moment for years, even if I hadn't known it back then. The pieces were finally falling into place, and now, I had to make sure everything I had built stood strong. No more hesitating. No more playing their game. It was time to play mine. I stepped out of the apartment, the sound of my boots against the pavement a steady rhythm in the quiet morning. I made my way to Sylvia's officer last stop before the final showdown. She was waiting for me, her usual calm demeanor. But today, even she couldn't hide the anticipation in her eyes. She had been my anchor, the one who kept me grounded when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Today, she was more than just a lawyer. She was a partner in this war, and together, we were about to take down an empire. "Everything's in place," Sylvia said as I entered her cluttered office. She handed me a file, thick with documents and evidence. "We've got the injunction, the signatures, the fraud. The judge is expecting us at 2 p.m. sharp." I nodded, my hands steady as I took the file. Inside, everything I needed was laid out: legal filings, bank transfers, the false signatures, the forged documents, all of it. The weight of it was not just in the paper, it was in the truth it carried. And I was about to make that truth burn through the lies my father had spent his life building. The clock ticked down. Every minute felt like an eternity. But this wasn't about time anymore. It was about justice, about reclaiming what was mine, about showing the world that they couldn't erase me from the story. I had been written out for too long. It was time to write myself back in. The courtroom was silent when we arrived, the air thick with tension. The judge, Rena Kinley, was already sitting at the bench, her expression as impassive as always. But I could see the shift in the room. The walls were closing in on Leonard, and he knew it. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something dark-era desperation that made his jaw tighten as I walked past him. Era, on the other hand, sat like a ghost, her eyes avoiding mine. She knew too. The walls were closing in on her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Sylvia and I took our seats, the weight of the file in my lap a reminder of everything that had led to this moment. It wasn't just a battle for the company. It was a fight for my name, for my legacy. And today, I was going to make sure they could never erase me again. The hearing began, and Leonard's lawyer, Benson Price, stood up with his usual smooth arrogance. But today, there was a crack in his demeanor. He could feel it, too. The tide was turning. "Your Honor," Benson began, "this is nothing more than a family dispute dressed up in legal jargon. Rowan Greaves has no standing. She abandoned her family, abandoned her name. And now, objection!" Sylvia's voice rang out, sharp and unwavering. "This isn't about family drama. This is about identity theft, fraud, and the unlawful seizure of a company. We have the evidence." She held up the binder, thick with proof. Benson's face paled slightly. The judge, Kinley, didn't bat an eye. "I'll allow it," she said, her voice cold as ice. "Proceed, Miss Marsh." Sylvia didn't hesitate. She walked to the front of the courtroom and handed over the binder to the judge. As Kinley flipped through it, Sylvia's voice filled the room. "We have documents that prove Rowan's signature was forged on multiple transfer agreements. These documents were filed under fraudulent pretenses. The assets of Braden Tech Systems were moved, sold, and transferred without Rowan's consent or knowledge." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "And we have proof that the death certificate, used to declare Rowan legally deceased, was falsified as well. Every step of this was a deliberate attempt to erase her." The courtroom was still. Leonard's face was a mask of fury, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. Era was frozen in place, her face pale as she looked down at her lap. The truth was a knife, and it was cutting through everything they had built. Sylvia continued, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "This isn't just a legal dispute, Your Honor. This is about accountability. These people tried to erase Rowan's existence, steal her inheritance, and sell her company for their own gain. This court must hold them accountable for their actions." She handed the binder to the judge, who took a long moment to read through the evidence. The tension in the room was unbearable, each passing second stretching out like an eternity. Finally, Judge Kinley looked up. "I find the evidence presented credible and compelling. The fraudulent activities of the Greaves family are extensive, and they will not go unpunished. My heart beat faster, but I didn't let myself react. Not yet. The battle wasn't won. Not yet. The court orders that all transfers of assets made under fraudulent pretenses be reversed. The Greaves family will be held accountable, and all actions taken against Rowan Greaves will be nullified. The words hit me like a wave, but I didn't let myself falter. I was still standing. Still here. Still fighting. Leonard stood up, his face red with rage. "This is not over," he shouted. "I will fight this." But his words were hollow. The battle was over. The empire he had tried to build on lies and deceit was crumbling before him. After the hearing, Sylvia and I walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the victory settling in. But I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. I still had work to do. "You did it," Sylvia said, her voice a rare mix of pride and relief. "You took them down." I nodded, but my mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't just about winning in court. This was about rebuilding what they had torn down. I had reclaimed my name, my inheritance, and my legacy. But now I had to make sure it stood for something more than just a victory. I stopped in my tracks. The sky had cleared, and the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the world was on my side. "I'm not done yet," I said. "I'm going to make sure they never forget who I am." The morning after the court hearing was a strange mixture of triumph and emptiness. The sun, bright and unforgiving, cast long shadows on the streets, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd ever really felt the warmth of a real victory. Or was it always just a war zone? The courthouse had been the final battlefield, but the aftermath felt like something I had to get used to. I had reclaimed my name, my inheritance, my legacy, but all that came with a new weight. Every step I took forward felt like I was walking on cracked glass, too aware of how fragile everything was. But there was no turning back. I wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. I was fighting for purpose. Sylvia had left the courthouse with a satisfied grin plastered on her face, but she knew, just like I did, that the real work was about to begin. We had exposed Leonard's lies, exposed the corruption within my family, and for the first time, I felt the weight of responsibility press down on Minot just as the heir to the Greaves legacy, but as the one who had to rebuild it. My phone buzzed as I sat at my kitchen table, sipping a cold coffee that had gone unnoticed for the past hour. It was a text from Miles, the forensic doc analyst who had been so instrumental in piecing the case together. "The board meeting is set for 1 p.m. We need to move fast. Get the injunction in place first. We'll have them trapped." I looked at the message for a moment, then tossed my phone back on the counter. This wasn't a game anymore. The people who'd wronged me weren't going to let it go. Leonard and Era wouldn't roll over. They would fight with everything they had left, but this time they weren't going to win. I arrived at the office a few hours later, but this wasn't just any office. It was the shell of what would become the Greaves Foundation. The walls were bare, the floors marked with paint streaks from where the contractors had just started the renovations. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no fanfare, just a quiet space filled with potential. Filled with the ghosts of my past and the promise of a better future. Dean, the veteran who had agreed to help me run the foundation, was already there. His weathered face looked like it had seen things most people would never imagine. But today, I saw a glint in his eyes, something more than just survival. It was purpose. "You ready?" I asked, standing in the doorway. Dean nodded, his hands resting on a blueprint spread out on the table. "Let's make sure we do this right." For everyone who didn't have a chance, I could feel the fire building inside me. This wasn't just a foundation. It wasn't just about building a place for veterans to find support. It was about rewriting everything that had been done to me, everything they'd tried to take from me. I walked over to the table and picked up the draft of our first program Operation Second Voice. It was simple, but it was everything. It would connect female veterans to resources, to each other, and to a community that understood them. It would be the first step in breaking down the barriers they'd built. "We're not just doing this for us," I said to Dean. "We're doing this for every person they ever tried to bury." He gave me a quick look, and for a moment, I could see the weight of his own past in his eyes. "I'm with you, Rowan. Let's build something they can't take down." By the time I arrived at the boardroom for the meeting, the weight of everything settled on my shoulders like armor. I wasn't just the granddaughter of Marshall Greaves anymore. I was the one who was going to take control of this company and do something meaningful with it. But first, I had to deal with the people who thought they could control me. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered it: polished, cold, sterile. Leonard sat at the head of the table, a scowl on his face as he glanced up from a stack of documents. Era sat beside him, her posture rigid, but her eyes betraying a hint of uncertainty. I knew she was struggling with the reality of what had just happened. She wasn't going to admit it, but I could see it in the way she looked at me. She knew I was the one who had won. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I walked straight to the chair at the opposite end of the table and sat down. Leonard didn't even look up. "You should have known better, Leonard," I said, my voice calm, but cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. "This isn't your empire anymore. It never was," he scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You think you can just walk in here and take everything we've built? You're a joke, a ghost." I didn't flinch. The word stung, but I had heard worse. Era shifted uneasily in her seat, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She knew she was just as much a part of the problem as Leonard was. "I didn't take anything from you, Leonard," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on his. "I'm just here to take what was always mine." His face turned red with anger, and I saw the familiar, dangerous spark in his eyes. But he was cornered now, and he knew it. I had the leverage, the proof, the legal backing, and in the end, he didn't have the control he thought he did. "You're not going to get away with this," he snarled. "I'll bury you. I'll drag you through the courts until you're nothing but a name on a file." I smiled, the smallest curve of my lips, a smile that had nothing to do with happiness. It was the kind of smile you give when you know you've already won. "Don't bother," I said. "You'll be too busy trying to stay out of jail." The room fell silent. The weight of the truth settled like a heavy cloud above us. Leonard and Era both knew that the game was over. This wasn't just about me taking over the company. It was about them being held accountable for everything they had done. "I'm not interested in revenge," I continued. "I'm interested in rebuilding. But not for you. Not for this family. For everyone you've overlooked. For every person you've hurt. You're out. And I'm going to make sure you stay that way." The meeting ended with no more words. Leonard and Era walked out of the room, their heads down, defeated. I didn't feel any satisfaction. Not yet. The real work was just beginning. But I wasn't walking away from this anymore. I wasn't the ghost they tried to bury. I wasn't the person they could just erase. I was Rowan Greaves. And I was going to make sure the world knew it. I stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the city skyline. It was a new beginning. For me, for the company, for everyone who had been silenced. And I wasn't about to let them take that away from me. The day after the boardroom confrontation, things settled into an eerie calm. Leonard and Era didn't show up at the office, which didn't surprise me. They had already lost. The power shift was undeniable, but the question remained: would they retreat into silence, or would they strike back harder? I sat in my office, the blinds half open, letting the early morning light filter through. I wasn't sure what exactly I was waiting for. I had already taken control of the company, the assets, the shares, the influence. But somehow, it felt like I was still in the middle of a battle, not at the end of one. The phone buzzed on my desk. Sylvia's name flashed on the screen. I picked it up, trying to push aside the anxious feeling in my gut. "You got a minute?" she asked, her voice as steady as always, but I could tell there was something she wasn't saying. "Of course, what's going on?" "I just got off the phone with Miles," she said. and we need to move fast. Leonard's pulling a few strings behind the scenes. He's not done yet. I leaned forward in my chair, my fingers curling around the edge of the desk. What's he planning? Fraud, mostly, she said, her tone clipped. He's trying to find a way to get his hands on the assets that are tied up in your name. He's talking to a few people in the legal world, trying to buy time and get things reversed. But there's more. We're not just dealing with a man trying to keep his wealth. We're dealing with someone who's willing to burn everything down just to make sure he stays on top. My heart pounded harder in my chest. Leonard was dangerous. He didn't care about the truth, the law, or the family. He only cared about keeping his power. And I knew exactly how far he would go to keep it. We can't let him get away with this, I said, my voice low and steady. No, we won't. But we need to act fast. I'm setting up a meeting with the legal team to push for the injunction on the assets. If we don't lock this down soon, he'll have enough leverage to create a mess that could last years. I thought about what I had learned over the last few weeks, the lies, the betrayals, the manipulations. This was no longer just about money. This was about control, about showing the world that the Greaves name wouldn't be owned by people like Leonard. It was about taking back what was mine and rebuilding it with integrity. I'll be there in an hour, I said, hanging up the phone and standing up from my desk. My resolve hardened with every step I took. Sylvia was right. Leonard wasn't going down without a fight, but I was ready for him. I wasn't just playing defense anymore. The meeting was held in one of the top law firms in the city. Their offices were sleek, modern, with high-rise windows offering a view of the entire city. It felt like a place where people made and broke empires. I walked into the conference room, where Sylvia and Miles were already seated at the large glass table. They were joined by a few of the firm's senior partners, people who dealt with high-profile cases, the kind that could ruin careers with a single wrong move. These were the kind of people I needed on my side. Sylvia stood as I entered, giving me a look of silent reassurance. She knew I was ready for this. We don't have time to waste, I said as I took my seat. What's the plan? Miles, who had been scanning through a stack of documents, looked up and nodded. We've verified everything on our end. The forged signatures, the fraudulent transfers, all of it. But we need more. We need irrefutable proof that Leonard's been manipulating the board and funneling assets through illegal channels. We can't just rely on hearsay anymore. And we have to hit him where it hurts, Sylvia added. The financial system won't move fast enough unless we tie this to criminal activity. Fraudulent signatures and wire transfers are a start. But we need something that will make the courts act immediately. I nodded. The walls were closing in on Leonard, but I knew this wouldn't be easy. He had money, connections, and a ruthless determination. But I wasn't backing down. Where do we stand with the injunction? I asked. We've got a good chance, one of the senior partners said. But we need a solid case. If we can present the forged documents and prove that Leonard has been moving assets illegally, we can freeze everything. But we need to move fast. Once he figures out we're onto him, he'll have his lawyers circling like vultures. I clenched my jaw. Then we need to move faster. The next few days were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and late nights spent reviewing documents. The legal team worked tirelessly, cross-referencing every piece of evidence we had, while Sylvia and I continued to dig into Leonard's financial records, trying to find the smoking gun that would end this fight once and for all. I didn't sleep much during those days. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Leonard's face, his arrogance, his disdain for everything I stood for. I had to stay ahead of him. If I let my guard down for even a second, everything I had fought for could slip through my fingers. But finally, it came. The breakthrough. One of the partners had uncovered an untraceable wire transfer that Leonard had made to an offshore account transfer that tied directly to the fraudulent sale of Braden Tech's assets. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the proof we needed to bring him down. I sat in the conference room with Sylvia and Miles, staring at the evidence on the table. The wire transfer, the forged signatures, the trail of lies. This was it. "We've got him," Sylvia said, her voice steady but triumphant. I nodded. It's time to end this. The injunction was filed that afternoon, and by the end of the week, the courts had issued a temporary freeze on Leonard's assets. The news hit the press like a tidal wave. The Greaves name, once a symbol of power and wealth, was now a symbol of corruption. The public saw the truth, and Leonard's empire began to crumble. But I wasn't done. The war wasn't over. I was only just beginning. The next step was to take back what was rightfully mine, not just the company, but the legacy. I had spent too long being erased, being reduced to nothing. I wasn't just going to inherit a name, I was going to build something from the ground up that they could never touch again. And this time, no one could erase me. The weeks after the injunction felt surreal. I had been so focused on the immediate battle that I hadn't fully realized the enormity of the situation. Leonard had been pushed into a corner, and the panic was beginning to show. I had frozen his assets, publicly exposed his fraudulent activities, and seized control of Braden Tech. Yet I could still feel the tension in the air. It was as if I were walking on the edge of a precipice, waiting for someone to push me off. The media frenzy surrounding Leonard's fall from grace didn't help. Every day brought a new article, a new leak, a new story about the Greaves family corruption. Headlines were written in bold, unforgiving ink. Greaves heiress fights back. Family fortune in ruins. As I sat in my apartment, staring out at the city skyline, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The sound of the doorbell snapped me back to reality. I hadn't been expecting anyone. Still, I walked over to the door and peered through the peephole. It was Sylvia. I opened the door quickly, not wanting to be caught off guard. "You look like hell," she said, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. I shrugged. "It's been a long couple of weeks. Come on, you need to get out of here for a while." She stepped inside, dropping her bag on the floor before heading to the couch. I didn't argue. Sylvia had a way of reading people better than anyone else, and I could tell she was right. I needed a break from the constant pressure, the endless meetings, the threats from Leonard's legal team. I needed to reset, even if only for a few hours. "All right, what do you have in mind?" I asked, sitting down next to her. "You're going to come with me to a meeting," she said. "I've got someone who can help us finalize things." My eyebrows raised. "Help us with what?" "With putting an end to Leonard's game," she said, leaning forward. "I've found someone who can tie up all the loose ends. We've got evidence, but we need the right leverage to finish him for good." I stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll go. But if this is another one of your shady connections, you know I'm not interested." She smirked. "Don't worry, this one's clean. Trust me." We drove in silence for most of the ride. The tension was palpable between us, but I could feel the calm energy that Sylvia projected. It was reassuring. She was always the rock I could count on, even when I wasn't sure of myself. The meeting was at a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. Sylvia led me down a narrow hallway to a door at the end. She knocked twice, and a moment later, the door opened. Inside was a man who looked like he belonged in an action movie, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a suit that seemed to fit him just a little too well. His sharp eyes met mine as he stood up and extended his hand. "Rowan Greaves, I presume," he said, his voice smooth and firm. I shook his hand, trying not to let the curiosity get the best of me. "Who are you?" "Name's Miles Crow," he said with a smile. "I'm the man who's going to make sure Leonard Greaves doesn't get away with this." Miles led us into a small conference room with a sleek wooden table in the center. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've been doing some digging," Miles said, sitting down and pulling out a file. "And I've got something that'll end Leonard's whole operation. You've got the evidence, but we need to make sure it sticks." I sat down across from him, folding my arms. "What do you have?" Miles slid the file across the table. Inside was a series of documents, board meeting minutes, financial transactions, legal filings. But one sheet caught my eye. It was a bank statement, showing a transfer of millions of dollars from a secret account linked to Leonard's holdings. "This," he said, pointing to the paper, "is the smoking gun. It ties Leonard directly to an offshore account used to funnel the stolen funds. If we go public with this, it'll destroy him." I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. This was bigger than I had imagined. Leonard hadn't just been embezzling from the company. He had been hiding it in plain sight, covering his tracks with enough complexity to make it almost impossible to detect. "This is it," I said, my voice steady. "We can take him down with this." Miles nodded. "But we need to time it right. If we move too fast, Leonard will find a way to bury it. If we wait too long, we risk giving him time to spin the narrative." I glanced at Sylvia, who was watching me carefully, as if waiting for me to make the final decision. "Let's do it," I said. "Let's make sure he never gets to play this game again." The next few days were a whirlwind. Miles worked with a team of forensic accountants and cyber experts to ensure everything was airtight. Sylvia handled the legal side, preparing the press release and lining up the necessary court filings. I kept a low profile, knowing that the storm was coming, and when it hit, it was going to be a hurricane. And then it happened. The article broke just before dawn. Greaves' heiress takes control. Family fortune exposed in fraud scandal. The headline was everywhere, from corporate news outlets to gossip blogs. The media erupted, questioning Leonard's integrity and the legitimacy of his dealings. But the real story came in the next wave. Attached to the article was an exclusive. The bank statement, the offshore accounts, the proof of the illegal transfers. Leonard's empire crumbled faster than I could have imagined. By mid-morning, his lawyers were scrambling to deny everything. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The phone rang in the middle of the chaos. I answered without looking at the screen. "Rowan." Leonard's voice came through, thick with anger. "You've made a mistake. This isn't over." I wasn't surprised by the call. But I wasn't afraid either. "It is over, Leonard," I said, my voice calm. "You just don't know it yet." I hung up, knowing I'd finally won. The battle wasn't over, but the war was. Leonard had underestimated me. He had thought he could erase me from the family, from the company, from the world. But I had something he never would: determination, grit, and the will to fight for what was mine. I looked out the window of my office, watching the city wake up below me. This was just the beginning. I wasn't done rebuilding yet. The city had a way of changing in the early hours. The streets were quieter. The sky still holding on to the dark remnants of night. And the world seemed just a little more malleable. I stood at my office window, staring out at the skyline, letting the weight of everything wash over me. This had started as a fight for survival, but now it felt like something bigger. I wasn't just fighting for the inheritance anymore. I was fighting for my place in a world that had tried to erase me. And I was winning. But with victory, the aftermath was always harder. People who'd been quiet were now watching. People who'd once stood by me now had doubts. I was no longer just Rowan Greaves, the soldier who walked away. Now, I was someone much harder to define, much harder to ignore. And Leonard? He was still out there, trying to make a comeback, but the cracks in his foundation were too deep now. Even he couldn't mend it. Sylvia had been busy, pulling the strings behind the scenes. While the media focused on Leonard's public embarrassment, we were making sure the legal side of things was locked down. She had connections in places that mattered: lawyers who'd seen the inside of too many backroom deals, and a network of journalists who could make or break someone with a single headline. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. I wasn't sure how long I could stay ahead of Leonard, but I was damn sure I wouldn't let him crawl back up. "I have an update." Sylvia's voice broke through my thoughts as she entered my office, her heels clicking sharply on the wooden floor. I turned to face her. She didn't look like the kind of person to bring bad news, but there was a tense edge in her posture, something about the way her fingers tapped against the folder in her hands that made me brace myself. "What's going on?" I asked. "Leonard's getting desperate," Sylvia said, sitting down across from me. "He's started making moves with the board. trying to secure his position again, but there's something else. I raised an eyebrow. What? There's a backup plan, she said quietly. A contingency. And it's not good for you. I leaned forward, my interest piqued. What kind of contingency? Era, she replied, her voice low. She's been working with someone outside the family, someone who has connections to an international investment group. They're planning to buy up shares and essentially take the company from you. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Era? She's working with Leonard? Sylvia nodded. Not exactly. She's making her own move. And this time, she's not doing it for family. She's doing it for herself. The moment she gets control, she plans to liquidate the assets. I let the weight of her words sink in. I had known Era was ambitious. But this was different. This was betrayal on a level I hadn't anticipated. You're sure about this? I asked, my voice steady but the fire inside me growing. I have confirmation, Sylvia said, flipping the folder open. I've been tracking some of her actions, the emails, the wire transfers. She's already in talks to secure votes from a few board members loyal to her. I clenched my fists. So, it's not enough that Leonard has tried to erase me. Now she wants to sell the company off to the highest bidder? Sylvia gave a slight nod. Exactly. And it's happening fast. They're planning to move by the end of the month, Rowan. You need to make your move before they do. That evening, I met with Miles. He had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, tracking every move, verifying every document. He was methodical, precise, a fact I relied on heavily. I couldn't afford any mistakes now. We sat in his office, the harsh light of his computer screen casting shadows on his face. He handed me a printout of Era's latest activities, including the shell companies she was using to launder her acquisitions. It was all in black and white. They've got a plan, Miles said. But it's sloppy. Too many people involved. Someone's bound to slip up. And when they do, we'll be ready. I nodded. We can't let her win this. We need to strike before they can make their move. Miles leaned back, folding his arms. There's something else you need to know. I raised my eyes, wary. What? Era's leverage isn't just her money, Miles said, his tone grave. She's got leverage on the board members, on some of your dad's old allies, and she's not afraid to use it. I exhaled slowly, a plan forming in my mind. Then we take that leverage away from her. The next few days were a whirlwind of strategy. Sylvia and I worked together to get everything in order. We contacted the key players, the people who had information on Era's deals. We needed to make sure no one stood in our way when we made our final move. I couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. And then, on the morning of the big board meeting, everything fell into place. I stood in the elevator, my reflection staring back at me, cold and composed. I was no longer the woman who had walked away from everything. No longer the soldier who had fought alone. I was a force to be reckoned with. The doors opened. The boardroom was silent when I entered. My father sat at the head of the table, his face pale, his eyes narrowed. Era was there too, her usual smug expression gone, replaced by something more calculating. She had no idea what was coming. I took my seat at the table, glancing around at the other board members, noting the unease in their eyes. They knew, as I did, that everything was about to change. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice cutting through the tension. I've come to make sure we're all on the same page. Era's eyes flickered with suspicion. I've already spoken to a few of you privately, I continued, locking eyes with the board members who had been working behind my back. And I've made sure that everyone knows where their loyalties lie. Era stiffened. She opened her mouth to speak, but I silenced her with a simple gesture. You've been playing a dangerous game, Era, I said, leaning forward. And now the rules have changed. I slid the documents across the table. They were undeniable. Proof of her deals, her backdoor manipulations. Everything she had been trying to hide. Your leverage is gone, I said. And your plans? They're over. Era's face paled as the weight of the documents sank in. You can't prove any of this. She spat. But there was a tremble in her voice. I don't need to prove it to you, I replied calmly. I'm not the one on trial here. You are. The room was silent, save for the sound of Era's breath quickening. The board members looked around at one another, shifting uncomfortably, and then, finally, Leonard spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of someone who knew they'd lost. I see now, he said, his gaze shifting between Ara and me. I've underestimated you, Rowan. I smiled. You always did. The tension in the room was palpable as Leonard and Era sat across from me, their faces stricken with disbelief. My father's pride and my sister's ambition had always been their strongest weapons, but now both were crumbling under the weight of truth. The documents before them, irrefutable and damning, exposed every manipulation, every lie they'd orchestrated. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes sweeping over the room. The board members, once loyal to my father, now appeared like scattered pawns, unsure of which side to take. Some were shifting uncomfortably, others avoiding eye contact, but all of them knew that the game was over. Leonard cleared his throat, his voice tinged with a mix of anger and resignation. You think this is over, Rowan? You think you've won just because you have a few documents? Your company was never meant for someone like you. You don't have the experience, the understanding, the connections. You're just a soldier who doesn't know what to do with power. His words struck like a slap, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I met his gaze head-on. He was angry, cornered, and lashing out, but I had something he would never understand, the right to be here. I had earned this seat. I had earned everything they had tried to take from me. I'm not here to play by your rules, Leonard, I said calmly. I'm here to make sure this company, this legacy, doesn't go up in flames because of your greed. Era shifted in her seat, her face tight. She had remained silent through most of this, but now, I could see the cracks in her composure. She was used to being the one in control, used to using her looks and charm to get what she wanted. But here, in this moment, there was nothing she could do. Nothing she could say. You think you're in control now, Rowan? Era finally spoke, her voice edged with bitterness. You have nothing. You have no friends, no allies. You're a threat to the family, and you think you can just take everything for yourself? That's where you're wrong, Era, I replied. I'm not taking anything. I'm simply keeping what was always meant to be mine. And you? You're the one who tried to sell it all for a quick buck. She was visibly shaken now, her usual composure slipping. But I wasn't finished. I leaned forward, allowing the weight of my next words to settle in the room. You've betrayed everything this company stood for, and I'm not the only one who sees that. I turned to the board members, locking eyes with each of them. You all signed off on the fraudulent transactions. You let Leonard and Era lead you down this path. Now, it's time for you to choose. Are you with them, or are you with me? The room was still. Every eye was on me, waiting for someone to speak up. Leonard looked around, his anger flaring. This is a witch hunt, he spat. You don't understand what you're doing. You'll ruin this company, this family. You'll ruin everything. No, I said, my voice steady, unwavering. You did that when you tried to erase me. I'm just finishing what you started. And then, the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment I'd worked for, arrived. The board members began to speak, their voices hesitant but growing in strength. One by one, they agreed. They sided with me. They acknowledged the truth of what had been done and realized that they could no longer be complicit in Leonard and Era's schemes. Leonard's face twisted with fury, but he didn't say another word. He knew it was over. The meeting adjourned, but I couldn't shake the feeling of finality that hung in the air. Leonard and Era were defeated. But the battle wasn't truly over. There was still work to be done, repairs to be made. decisions to be finalized, and a company to rebuild. I walked out of the boardroom, the doors closing behind me with a soft click. For the first time in years, the weight on my shoulders felt lighter. The fight wasn't over, but I had won the first round, and now it was time to rebuild. A few days later, I sat in my office, the sunlight streaming through the windows, casting a warm glow over everything. The city below was bustling, but inside, it was calm. I was finally where I needed to be. I picked up the phone and dialed Sylvia's number. She answered on the first ring. "It's done," I said simply. "Good," she replied, her voice tinged with approval. "Now we start planning the future." I smiled. Exactly. As I hung up the phone, I looked around the office, taking in the familiar surroundings. This wasn't the life I'd expected, but it was the one I had earned. I had survived the battlefield, fought through betrayal and loss, and come out stronger on the other side. And I was just getting started. Later that evening, I stood on the rooftop of my building, looking out over the city. The wind rustled through my hair, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope Grandpa had given me. It had been a long road, but this moment was what he had prepared me for. I opened it slowly, pulling out the final piece of the puzzle. Inside was a letter, written in his familiar handwriting. It was simple, just a few lines, but it held everything I needed to hear. "Rowan, remember that some battles are fought not with weapons but with resilience. You are the future. Never forget that." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, tucking it into my coat pocket. I had come a long way, but the road ahead was still long. Still, for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a purpose. I had a legacy to uphold, and this time, no one would ever try to erase it. I walked back inside, ready for whatever came next. The foundation had been built, brick by brick, and it was strong, and no one could tear it down.